This is a talk on declarative fetching libraries by me, Riaz Virani. How many of you, looking back at your agenda, are like, that's not the name that was on the presentation of who's going to be giving this talk? If any of you know, the person who's supposed to give this talk is my wife, who is out sick. So I discovered last night that I'm giving this talk. So as in, this is Nia Panam Danam. I am not Nia Panam Danam. Also, I did not kidnap Nia Panam Danam. So yeah, we were just deciding last minute, should we just sort of cancel it, because she would start coughing up a lung up here. She doesn't have COVID. She basically has the cold I had a week and a half ago. It's now transferred to her, and I am now completely immune from it because I kind of went through it, so I'm not contagious at all. But we just decided to save you guys the risk of medical travesty. But if, again, since this is not my presentation, to be honest, I'm like halfway, we have the slides, and I'm like fairly familiar with the topic, but if you don't want to be part of this audience because you're like, what the hell, I show up and I'm like with the one speaker who's admitting that he doesn't actually know the material that well, I actually have I should take the slide off when people are coming in. That doesn't actually look right. Then you should go to a different talk. Otherwise, if you do stay here, you're gonna have a hell of a show. So, more so than some of the other ones. So I'm gonna reiterate to people who are just joining us, the person who's supposed to give this talk is out very badly sick. I am that person's husband, and we decided last minute not to back out of giving the talk, but instead I'm giving the talk in her stead. So if you want to go find another audience that you are with a speaker who knows what the hell they're doing, you should go do that. So everyone with me so far? Maybe I don't know some stuff. You guys will fill it in as we go. Yeah? Huh? Oh, yeah. Well, I'll be honest, I'm a lot less prepared for this than the first talk I gave, which was my actual talk. So maybe it'll be more entertaining then. But again, I did not kidnap Nia Panam Danam. That's the important takeaway. Okay, so let's actually get into the meat of the presentation. We're talking about declarative fetching libraries for React or really anything else. But what's the problem? The actual problem is we all spend way too much time writing boilerplate code to fetch and store data from our servers. So who kind of knows what I'm talking about, right? Most of the time we're like, great, I need to show a list of orders. Well, I gotta write some Axios call to hit my server, get the data, put it in state or Redux, and then have my UI display data from that. And then we do that like 1,000 times over and over in our code. So some very smart people thought, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this. So this is the old way we would do it, right? We'd have to write all of these pieces ourselves. We'd have to write the code on the server. We'd have to write the Axios or fetch call, right, to connect and get data from our server. We'd have to put it in Redux or state or something else or MobX or whatever the hell we want. And then we'd have our UI hook up to that state and have to render it. So declarative fetching generally is kind of, you think of it like React. We don't, if we think of HTML and React, et cetera, we don't actually write the HTML, we write the machine that generates it. And so we just say we want it to look like this. And that's kind of what declarative fetching is also doing. Looks like it's really kind of not high contrast here on the screen, but essentially the two middle pieces they're trying to get rid of and say, hey, these can just be done by common machinery that's not actually you writing it every time. You have to write your code on the server. You don't have to write your fetching code every time, and you don't have to actually figure out how to store it just for the purpose of rendering. You still have to decide what you want to display once the data is there, right? But you kind of eliminate a lot of the boilerplate in the middle. So here's the options in terms of libraries and tools that we're actually going to compare. Apollo Client has been around for a while. Who knows? Who's ever used Apollo Client knows of Apollo Client? I'd imagine like half the audience or so. Yeah. So Apollo Client's also got Apollo Server. It's been around for a while, but they're one of the more popular GraphQL-based fetching libraries. There's one called SWR. Who's ever heard of SWR? Okay, I thought so. That's from the people who made Next. And so SWR stands for Stale While Revalidate. And then there's TAN-Stack Query, but some of you may know that as React Query. They rebranded themselves recently, the maintainers did. Those are the three main options we're going to look at. Now, there are others, and if I'm not including your favorite one, don't lambast me. Like there's RTK query, there's like whatever query. It's JavaScript. There's probably like fuck it query. There's 20,000 kinds of queries. There's everything under the sun. We're just going to talk about these three. Why is that? They're definitely, I think, in this system, or sorry, in this space, they're probably three of the most popular ones. So this is sort of just, even looking as a comparison between them, Apollo Client generally is probably still the largest number of downloads. It's been around for a long time. Now React Query, this number is a little bit misleading because since they rebranded in the summer, there's also now TAN-Stack/Query, which is what they want you to use. And that's probably like, that would take that very right part of that orange line and add like a slope upwards to where it's almost meeting the blue line. So that's growing. They're all growing, but Apollo Client and React Query are probably the most full-featured and the most popular ones in this space. Before I move on, any kind of questions so far, anything I've said? Cool. All right, so we're going to look at each at a high level. We're going to look at a little bit of code of how just at a high level how they work. And then we're actually going to go through slides looking at features that declarative fetching libraries offer, what those features are, and then do each of the three offer them, because not every feature is offered by every single library. So Apollo Client is a summary. It's actually an offshoot from the team that made Meteor.js. Who remembers Meteor.js? Oh, one of you. Two? Wait, have the rest of you never used it or don't know what it is? Who? Both. Okay. Who has no idea? Who's never heard of Meteor.js at all before? Wow, man, I feel so fucking old. Well, Meteor.js was actually interesting. Look it up. It's still kind of around. It's like a combined server and client framework in one. But it was an offshoot from that team in 2016, specifically as a tool chain for GraphQL. Some of the same people that made Meteor.js were like, we're done with Meteor. We're going to create something called Apollo. There's also something called Apollo Server. So it's a GraphQL server. In this case, also a GraphQL client. So you have Apollo Server or client. You can use one or both. They do work really nicely together. And it also includes the ability to store non-server state as a holistic state management solution. So it's not just storing your server state. You can do what's called local state. And it can kind of replace Redux locally or use state is that like, storing just things that have nothing to do with fetching data from the server. It does seem to have the most number of haters. And I'm going to be honest about this. There's if you go read about it, there's a lot of freaking people complaining about like, oh, I used it and it's so complicated and it's glitchy and blah, blah, blah. That's just my anecdotal kind of thing, so take that with what you will. I don't actually like the library that much, but I don't understand why it has so much hate out there, like passionate blog articles shitting on it. So that's it. It is the only option that is GraphQL only. The other two options don't actually care about GraphQL. They're just sort of a pattern for fetching and storing. They don't care about the mechanism, but Apollo Client is GraphQL only. So if you've got a REST-based API, you cannot use this library at all. It also, by the way, it does support Vue, Angular, and Svelte. So we are talking here about React, but if you use those, some of the other ones do. In fact, actually, SWR is the only one that is React only. React Tan-Stack Query, which we'll go over in a second, also supports some of the other frameworks. So let's just look at some code, be like, what does this look like? And everyone knows the traditional model of like on, use effect, fetch some data, store it in state, render it, right? Okay, so for, let's say, Apollo Client, do some imports. We create an instance with sort of like, here's our general backend URL, right, for our API. And then we declare a cache, so it has a single instance of a cache to store data and memoize it. So if we just have plain render a React DOM tree, you wrap sort of your whole application in an Apollo provider, so it has one common context. You're passing in that client that we just created over here in just plain, not a hook or anything, just plain JavaScript. So somewhere else, if you want to get some data, you're going to declare a GraphQL statement. So everyone know what GQL is? Most of you? You're about half of you. Okay, so if you're using GraphQL, which again, Apollo Client is GraphQL only. This is your GraphQL syntax of how to fetch data. So this is basically saying, hey, please do the locations query and give me these attributes back. And then when you want to use it, this is where this is the sort of important part. You import the use query hook that came out of Apollo Client. You pass it the GraphQL statement, right, which is basically your query syntax. So what you endpoint slash, in the REST world, this would be like slash locations, right? But here it's the syntax to say of that GQL. And then it's just yielding you, am I loading? Do I have an error or data? You didn't write any other stuff. Like these values will just change for you on their own. All that boilerplate is gone. You can just say, oh, if I'm loading, show like a loader. If I have an error, show this. And if not, that means I have data, and then just render the data. So the magic here is, to declare these three in the world of old school, let's say Redux, like there would have been a like, hey, set loading equals false, fetch data, then set loading equals true, then loading equals false, then set data. Like you would have to write all this code. You don't have to do that anymore. Now, all of the libraries do something pretty much like this. The syntax is pretty similar, but there are some differences. Does this make sense to everyone so far in terms of like looking at this? Like anyone need a little bit of clarification? I'm happy to kind of dive into it a bit. All right, that makes total sense, right? So let's jump over to another library, SWR. SWR is created by the team that's sort of behind Vercel and Next.js. Who uses either of those libraries or tools? Next.js, I imagine, is the one. Is everyone at least familiar with like Next.js? Yeah, okay, cool. So they sort of saw this common problem and were like, we're gonna help make a library that integrates really well with Next.js, and really you can use it without Next.js too. It literally stands for stale while revalidate, it's SWR, and that's because what the library does. It is by far of the three main options the smallest and most lightweight in terms of feature set, in terms of the sort of complexity of the API that you have to understand as a developer, and bundle size. It's like only 11 kilobytes or something like that. It's really small. It's also agnostic of GraphQL or REST. So that thing where before we were just passing in the GQL, here you pass in a fetcher function, and that fetcher function can use fetch, Axios, GraphQL, like RPC, whatever you want it to do, right? And so you can use anything you want. So let's look some code here. This is a one screen kind of thing. You don't need any other screens. You simply import it. In fact, honestly, you don't have to even pass in this fetcher function into the hook there. It has a default magical one where it'll simply like take the URL and fetch against it. But you can pass in a fetch URL, which is just simply take whatever parameter I get, all Axios or fetch or whatever. And this is your use case of it. You do use SWR instead of use query. You pass in, this first part is like sort of the key that it uses to differentiate between your queries, a fetcher function, and then you get data error, and then you can add your own loader on top of it if you want to. Again, it looks very similar, right? Very little boilerplate. Well, let me pause there. Any other questions so far? Make sense? All right, TanStack query or React query for those of you that are fallen asleep since the summer when they rebranded, I guess. This was actually a pretty old library. They released it back in 2014 as React query, and that's actually only a year after React's initial release, I believe. I may be wrong about that, but in July of this year, it was rebranded as TanStack query. It is now maintained by this general open source organization called TanStack that has a bunch of other kind of big open source libraries. It is by far the heaviest and most full-featured of the libraries we're considering. It also does support Vue, Plain.js, Solid.js, and soon Svelte. So it's not, and also it is adapter agnostic. You can use it against GraphQL, you can use it against REST, you can use whatever call you want. Think of like Apollo client is very like GraphQL only. SWR is a very lightweight version. React query is just souped up SWR. Like it just has some more features, it has some more internal optimizations, it is heavier, but the difference between them is they're both excellent. It's gonna be kind of your preference. Do you prefer something a bit heavier that like, I wanna do this thing, and you just kind of look at their guide and they're like, great, turn on this toggle, instead of go think about it and implement it yourself. So their code is gonna look very, very similar. You're gonna instantiate a client, and then wrap your code in that client. Then they have a similar named hook called useQuery, similar to Apollo. And you pass in the function, which is the fetcher function. But unlike in SWR, where the parameter is automatically like whatever the query string is, here you define the query key yourself. Now, why do you need any of these keys anyways? Well, it has to be able to cache your data that comes back from this query, because what if you want to use this over and over and over again? We don't want to keep fetching multiple times, right? If you have 5 components looking for, let's say, whatever this data is. So this key tells it, hey, if I have 5 components that use the same query key that instantiate a use query, they're all the same query behind the scenes, so only do it once and yield it to all 5 components instead of having to redo it. So I guess I didn't explain that earlier. In this case, it's nice because they let you specify, they're not implicitly determining it, which is what SWR does. And yeah, then you have the fetcher, the key, and you determine how it renders based on the end. So, all right, now we're going to look at specific features of each of them. I'm not going to show you code here. Yeah, go ahead. You don't have to actually, but you can. There is like a global SWR provider that you hook it into. I may be wrong about this. This is where I haven't looked at this recently, but yeah, I think there is still a config. It's not called a provider. They called it a SWR config object. Yeah. I know that much. And then you can set global config options, because actually the third implicit parameter here is an options hash of like, do you want to read validate on focus? Do you want to poll? Things like that. And you can set those options globally. Good question that Nia would know how to answer. All right, normalized caching. Well, any other questions before I move on? Now we've kind of taken a really high level look at each of the 3 libraries. You're almost looking at the code being like, why would I decide between these? They all look pretty much the same, right? So let's look at normalized caching. So normalized caching is the concept essentially of the data that comes back, you kind of store it not in just here's the result of this query, but here's sort of a flat structure. An example might be like I'm querying for a list of users, right? If I do that 5 different ways on different sections of my page, some of the libraries are just fetching that data and they don't realize like, wait, user 1 here is the same as user 2, user 1 in this other context, and they just sort of keep the data that's fetched instead of thinking of it almost like a database of like, here's a table of all the users, right? Apollo does this. So behind the scenes, every returned record has sort of like an ID or a key. An example in this case, if you had a list of users, it doesn't care about the individual query, it keeps like a list of all your users. So if you do like a mutation to update one of the users, it updates this like one behind the scenes magical database it has. So this is where it gets into trouble because it's doing a lot of shit behind the scenes that's magical, and then when you don't understand what it's doing, people get into trouble. So the other ones don't care about that. The other ones are like, you asked me to make a query with these parameters, and these were the results. I don't know what's in them. I don't care if the return is a list of things. I don't know how to identify them. I don't know how to tell them apart. It's just data to them. So the benefit here is for certain kinds of applications. Imagine you have to load like a list of thousands of transactions, and then there's like update one transaction. And the other ones you have to know, oh wait, if I update one transaction, I have to refetch 5 different things that could have changed that were returning that transaction. In Apollo, it's like, no, I just update my local cache and I'm good to go, right? Does that make sense? It's kind of hard to explain, but it's where the other 2 basically work the way you think they do. They don't care about the data. This one does. Apollo does. All right, cache persistence. So you're fetching data. Behind the scenes, all 3 libraries are keeping a cache of the queries and responses. That way, if you ask for the same data again within a certain interval, they just won't fetch it again. Meaning like if you've got 5 components asking for the same data, they only fetch it once. Well, what if you like reload the page? Do you want to lose that cache, right? On just like a hard refresh. All of them have options to say persist the cache to local storage is a simple configuration option. And that's the thing that's universal across all of them, and you can control how long to keep the cache. You can control if you want to, you can configure custom cache stores if you want to use like CouchDB or something. That's available in all 3. Now all 3 of these are available, but it's just nice to know like, hey, a feature like this that were in the normal world, you would have to like, if you were just using plain React state and you wanted to store data across page loads, you'd have to write your own code, right? To use IndexedDB or local storage or something like that. Using a library like this means it's a configuration option. Polling. All of them support polling. Now again, if you're doing this yourself and you were like, I want to fetch data over and over, polling's kind of easy. You just do a set interval and be like, hey, keep fetching data, right? Well, again, here, this just becomes a configuration option for all 3 of them to say, I want you to refetch this data and show new data every 20 seconds. You just pass in literally a configuration option, and they'll do that. You can do that globally at a particular query level, however you want. Infinite queries. This is also something you can do, and it's pre-built in. An infinite query is where, imagine you have like an infinite list of things, right? Whenever you scroll down, it loads more records. Well, that kind of sometimes takes a bit of a hassle if you do it yourself. You got to be like, wait, okay, someone scrolled down, now I got to trigger another query and append the new results to the old results and make sure that none of the same items came back, and therefore I'm not showing things twice, right? In here, it's a configuration option. They've got, almost all of them have special hooks with special options of like the load more function, and it becomes really easy to do like infinite scrolling lists. Stale val revalidate. All of them also do that too. Stale val revalidate actually is a part of a cache header specification, but I guess they've adopted it, and actually SWR means that. So imagine that you've loaded the data once, and then like you've said, hey, I want the data to not be stale more than 30 seconds. So at some point, it's going to fetch the data again. So what happens then? Do you show like the browser or the user like a loading state? Why? Because you've decided to fetch the data over. So instead what it does is, if you tell it to refresh new data, it'll keep in that data option, it'll keep giving you the old data while it's fetching the new data. And then only when it gets new data will it show new data. So you kind of get, again, it shows the stale data while it's revalidating within a certain time frame that's been configured. All 3 of them also support that too. Now this is actually a really, really valuable tool, because otherwise you can create this really jittery interface, because if in your own world, if you were like, hey, I'm going to refresh my data like every time someone comes back to focus the page, or every time someone clicks around, or every 30 seconds, what happens? It's just like if you had a loader show up, it would constantly flicker the loader and flicker it back to the data, right? Well, these libraries make it seamless where it's like, no, we'll just do it in the background, and we already have memorized the old data, versus in state, you actually would have to keep a copy of the old data and the new data, right? Because they could be competing. Fetch on focus. I want to pause real quick. I've been going through like 5 or 6 of these features, and again, it's kind of hard to show code for each one. Do all the previous ones I've shown make sense as concepts? Okay, cool. So fetch on focus, this was actually one of my favorite ones, which was whenever, let's say, you load some data on a page and then someone tabs over to a different screen and then comes back, let's say they come back a day later, right, because they just left the tab open. What happens? Without you doing anything, they see a day-old data, right? So all of these libraries automatically detect focus on the page, and by default, unless you tell them not to, every time someone clicks away and clicks back, they'll refetch the data for you from your API and hydrate it. You can configure, like, if they're clicking too fast, like some sort of threshold for that. SWR, like, that's a first-class citizen to them. That literally is what that means, stale while revalidate. Tan-stack query, React query does this again automatically. You just don't do anything, and magically they're handling this, keeping your data up to date on the screen. Apollo client doesn't have this built in. You could certainly write your own kind of like window.add event listener, visibility change, call, refresh the query, but it's not automatic. It's something you have to do yourself. Render batching. This is actually really cool. This is actually the wrong copy for this, but whatever. I think I probably was messing with the slides and there. So this is where they actually, tan-stack query keeps track of the attributes from the responded data that you're actually using inside of your render, and therefore won't force a re-render if it realizes you're not reading that attribute. So if you get back like a data, and you have first name, last name, and email, and the only thing you actually show in your UI is first name, last name, and then you refetch the data, and at some point first name and last name haven't changed, even if the data's been reloaded, it will not force a re-render in your UI. So it's just like magically, it knows behind the scenes what you're using. It's a thing in JavaScript called proxies. Very fancy, but as a magical thing, all those refetches don't cause re-renders unless they're changing something on the screen, which I thought was magical. Like the amount of re-renders that just go away with all this constant fetching is kind of really helpful. Selectors. So everyone know what selectors are from like Redux land. Like you've got, again, in previous example, you have first name, last name, and you might compute full name, something from that. So selectors are where it's like, hey, please don't recalculate how to write the full name over and over and over on every render. That's built into tan-stack query, and that is kind of built into Apollo with something called local keys. They don't call it selectors, but it's basically the same thing. SWR, this is where, like I said, it's just a simplified version of tan-stack query where it's not built in. You can create your own implementation, but if you have to like get data and then compute something off of it, you just don't get the magical optimization done for you. Dedicated dev tools. So this is actually really nice. So normally, if you're writing your own stuff and it's like, well, I got to do some debuggers and some console.logs and I can just look at the network tab. Now, they all do it a little bit differently, but all 3 of them have dedicated dev tools to inspect sort of what they're doing, right? Because they're doing some magic for you. Tan-stack query is actually not a Chrome extension. It's actually something you can embed right onto the page. So you could like enable it on your dev or QA site. And it'll just appear on the page magically as like a little floating window. And then SWR does not have official dev tools, but there are some pretty good community-run dev tools that are a Chrome extension. And Apollo, I believe, it's a Chrome extension, but it is something that's kind of partially written and maintained by the Apollo people themselves. So again, just like in the old days, what was one of the reasons to potentially use Redux? Redux dev tools, right? All 3 of these, you're not left in the dark about what they're doing. You can kind of see what they're doing, see when they're fetching, see what they're getting, see why they're choosing to fetch or not refetch for you on your behalf. I know that was a fast. Maybe there's more stuff I was supposed to say, but that's the presentation. All right, guys, any questions? A question, who currently is like using a declarative fetching library of some sort? 1, 2, 3, about half of you guys. What are you guys using? React query? React query? Apollo? Okay, so no one's using SWR, at least in this audience. You're using SWR? What's like your experiences with it so far with all of them? Like, was this a big debate on your teams? Did you guys like start with it? Did you guys try it later? Is it working? You know?
Encouraged at my company to use query on top of our API layer.
Yeah.
We definitely use the implementation. It's encouraged definitely when we write our packages to make sure that we're using security, and if we need to cache it, to be aware of what we're caching. Sometimes we don't always agree on what we should be caching, but we try to have a conversation about that.
So is it something that generally people, like, while I'm sure everyone has some gripes about every library they use, is it something that generally the team likes? Yeah?
Well, I love React myself. I think other people in the company have also learned to love it as well.
Yeah?
The documentation is clear on it. Very helpful.
Cool. What about, I guess, a few of the people using React query or tan stack queries they call it now? Is that similar to your company's experiences? It's like generally been a net positive? Yeah?
We started using it about 3 weeks ago, so we started with that as a way to improve performance.
Yeah, fair enough. So anyone having a specifically, like with any one of them, like we used it and we hated it and we want to get back out of it? Or does anyone like have it? Because usually what ends up happening with stuff like this is it all comes about because we all start without like a pattern or framework. This happens over and over in React, right? We all start without a pattern or framework. We make things too big and then we're like, shit, this is complicated. And then we're like, oh, let's invent this solution. And then we all have to like migrate to it after the fact, right? But sometimes there's a few people that started with it and then stuff gets big and then they're like, no, we want to remove the magic and we want to like go back to something more like handwritten. Is anyone having that experience of like, no, we're trying to get rid of declarative fetching? Oh, fascinating. Okay. Yeah.
I had an issue with not knowing about how error handling is processed with React query.
Mm-hmm.
They do the basic level of like if there's a network issue, it'll help you throw something. What I didn't know is if you have specific server errors that are not considered successful, React query doesn't really care about that. You have to handle all that. And maybe that's a given in most libraries, but that was something I discovered.
Yeah, I think the fetcher only cares about whether you're throwing an error or returning a failed promise. So if your server, like if you're like using the fetch API and you get a 404 back from your server, if you don't throw an error, it'll essentially be like, well, you got to validate. Like maybe that's what you're supposed to get back. Like I'm not going to decide that for you. And then you kind of end up in no man's land, like, why is this not failing? Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah. No. It's always the trade-off with magic, right? Which is like, where does the magic start and end? Someone here was using Apollo, right? This is the one I'm most curious about. Were you using Apollo? Yeah. Okay, so I last used Apollo personally when it was like Apollo 1 or 2, and I hated it. So I'm curious what your experience is now, because I'm sure they matured it and improved it over the years with Apollo 3. What's been your experience?
It's been a positive experience. I think the way they normalize the caching now is improved.
Yeah.
The way performance is customized. We're liking it. Everyone's getting on the Apollo transaction.
Are you guys using it to store, they call local state as well, or just the server state? Local state as well? Interesting. Cool. Well, I mean, I guess the cool part about this is that like it seems like most people, I mean, a lot of times like people just disagree in general, but it seems like at least everyone's in the bandwagon of like, hey, like we all have this exact same problem, and at least it's better to use something like declarative fetching than to not use it. That's awesome. Yeah, we've got about like 20 minutes left. So I'm happy to let you guys out early. Again, I can answer some questions. For those of you that came in late, and I gave a whole spiel about I'm not the person. These are the slides I added like 10 minutes before I started this, because that's not me. That's the person who's supposed to give this talk. That's not me. I did not kidnap her. That's my wife, who was very sick, and we were deciding last minute, like, do we just cancel on her? Cancel on particular, she really didn't want to, and then she was like, why don't you do it? And I was like, sure. And then she sent the email being like, all right, Riaz is going to talk instead of me. And then I was like, wait, what is your talk again? Like, because I gave my talk this morning. So hopefully it wasn't too bad for you guys and you guys got something out of it, and it wasn't total. I was like telling people at the very, very start, it's like either you can just like walk out now because there's some great talks to go to, or you can just watch the dumpster fire that's about to happen and be entertained by it. So I'll leave that up there for you guys. All right, any other questions or thoughts? Awesome, guys. Well, all right, I will conclude. I'm happy to answer any of the questions I might be able to answer, and enjoy the rest of the event.